Now, Labor rammed that social media ban for kids through the Senate before Christmas because, well, they didn't really have much else to speak of in terms of achievements this year. But there's a poll today by Resolve Political Monitor that shows most Australians support the idea of banning under 16s from social media. That's not really surprising. But most don't think it'll work, and they don't want to hand over their IDs to make it work. Let's bring in my panel for tonight. Victorian Libertarian Party MP David Limbrick and the PR Council Managing Director Christy McSweeney. Now, the numbers here are quite interesting. 58% support a ban, but 68% don't think it'll be effective. 45% are reluctant to hand over ID. And rather surprisingly, parents are more likely to support a ban than those without kids. That's not the surprising bit. But they're also more likely to think that it'll be ineffective, and they're more reluctant to submit ID than those without kids. So, David, we have here a policy that broadly people like me say is noble, the idea is good, but no one seems to think it's actually going to work.
Australians have a good nose for what goes wrong with government IT projects, I think. They nearly always fail. I remember there was an app a few years ago called the COVID Safe app, and I remember lots of members of parliament showing people installing it on their phones and spent millions of dollars on it. And it did nothing. It never worked. It was a failure. In fact, one of my boys, he uses YouTube like many kids. He actually produces his own content. And I told him about this, and his first response was, "Does this mean we'll need to get a VPN, Dad?" And I said, yes, it does. Kids already know how to bypass this, and it's clearly people know that it won't work. It's a failure from the beginning.
And most people, not an absolute majority, Christy, it's 45%, but it's more than on the other side of the ledger. Most people say that they're worried about handing over their ID. They don't want to hand over their ID. And of course, this was a large part of the discussion, and you were, told, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist or whatever if you said it could potentially mean that your speech online gets linked to your ID. But people are actually worried about this stuff, and rightly so, because if you one day end up with a digital ID or whatever being linked to your social media accounts, people go, well, I don't want to be tracked. If I criticise the government, the same government that wanted to bring in mis and disinfo laws to say what I could and couldn't say on social media, I don't want them to know who I am.
Well, there's a number of pieces to unpack here. Unfortunately, the government doesn't want to unpack them. Both the coalition and the government have been guilty of supporting a soundbite thought bubble and are falling over themselves to prove who thought of it first, rather than to work with Australia's leading technology industry and figure out a solution. I've heard David Coleman, the opposition communications spokesperson, quote payment platforms like Afterpay as expertise for social media. Now, that is about how far the technology industry has been invited to consult. And of course, it is noble, as you say, Caleb. It's wonderful that mental health advocates, children's bullying experts, teachers, educators, health administrators have been involved. But when the Murdoch Children's Research Institute confront a committee that shut down within 24 hours and the technology industry can't, we can see what is at play here. There's no coincidence at all that online gambling reforms and the social media ban are running concurrently with the potential to use the same ID digital gate technology to solve both of those public policy problems. It's a packed agenda for government. It's a packed agenda for the coalition. Both sides haven't taken the time to isolate what is actually important policy in here. And what's important is saving kids with tools that work. So ban it, but it's got to work.
Yeah, and of course it came up at the same time as the now dead misinformation and disinformation bill, and that wasn't a coincidence.